right, down to the last two chapters, down to antitrust law and labor law. So let's talk antitrust first. So before I get into what antitrust is, and you've probably guessed one from reading the definition of monopoly on there, but also from the Monopoly guy picture there in the lower right, we should talk about why this is even included in the course. And the reason for that is because antitrust litigation has played an important role in reshaping professional sports. Athletes have challenged a number of practices, including the reserve system, in which a team controls a player for a certain amount of time, the draft in various leagues, commissioner powers, particularly in the NFL, and free agent compensation systems under antitrust legislation. So, antitrust legislation has also been used against the NCAA, with varying degrees of success on issues related to player eligibility, broadcasting issues, particularly NCAA control of broadcast rights, coach earnings, and commercialism. So you can see there the definition of a monopoly. So a monopoly is exclusive control by one group of the means of producing or selling a product. And so then I've got the little monopoly man there in the lower right. Monopoly and trust are effectively synonymous. And so, since they mean the same thing, antitrust is effectively anti-monopoly, right? And so, people have challenged things like, as I mentioned, the NFL draft as being anti-competitive, arguing that the NFL held a monopoly. And so, we'll talk about the specifics of that here in a second. So, as always, we'll start with a little bit of historical introduction because, the law doesn't occur in a vacuum. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is what enshrines this concept in law. And so you can see there the Sherman Antitrust Act became law in 1890. Well, why did that happen then? What's the background for that? And the background is that the era between the 1870s and 1900 is referred to as the Gilded Age. And so what that name alludes to is the idea that there were lots and lots of social problems that were being masked by a thin layer of gold covering. So if something is gilded, the inside can be wood or various other metals. Not that wood is a metal, but things other than gold, and then there's an outer covering of gold. And so it's gilded. It looks like it's gold, but it's just that outer covering. And so what that gold is covering may be something like lead that's completely worthless, possibly harmful, or wood, or anything else, right? So the Gilded Age in the U.S. was this time of dramatic economic growth. Some people got really, really rich, and so that was the gilding part, right? There are all of these success stories, these people that became tremendously wealthy, but they did so at the expense of workers a lot of the time. So there are a lot of worker safety issues at this time. There are a lot of social problems. So work-related issues include really long hours and no regulation on those hours, low pay, frequent injuries, and if you were injured on the job, there was often, and probably never really, any sort of protection for those workers. So if you, in history class, the classic piece of literature related to this is a book by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. If you ever get a chance, it's a good read. It is kind of depressing because every time something starts to look up for the immigrant family in the book, then something terrible happens. But the gist of it, one of the reasons I mentioned that book, and one of the reasons it's important is, if somebody gets injured at work and they lose a hand and they're unable to work, well, then there's no sort of workers' compensation system for that, right? Basically, all the company does is replace them, and if that person can't work, then potentially they could starve. And so that's where the idea of the Gilded Age comes from. So you've got these people that make tons and tons of money, people like Rockefeller, people like Andrew Carnegie, etc. But then you've got these really sad stories of individuals who are injured at work, have no protections, there's no social safety net, none of those kinds of things. Speaking of Rockefeller and Carnegie, so those are the two primary individuals whose companies spurred the passage of this law. So Standard Oil was owned by John D. Rockefeller, U.S. Steel was owned by Andrew Carnegie. And one of the problems is that they both got so big that they completely controlled the market for oil and steel in either case. And so Because each of those companies controlled their respective markets, that lack of competition left consumers with only one option, which was to pay what either of those companies charged or to go without. And so that lack of competition, further, would stifle growth of the overall economy. And so the president at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, led the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so the idea here is that competition will both encourage innovation and drive down prices. Because if you're the only company in the steel game, you have no reason to bring your prices down. But if you've got competition, somebody can do it better, faster, cheaper, well, then that's going to encourage you to innovate and to change your prices as well. And so the whole idea of the Sherman Antitrust Act is to promote competition so that the consumer gets better products, gets cheaper products, and that people are constantly revising the way that they do business, the way that they manufacture, etc., so that we can get, again, constantly or consistently better products, new ideas, new products brought to market, those kinds of things. All right, so there are two relevant sections to the Sherman Antitrust Act, Section 1 and Section 2. And so Section 1 deals with restraint of trade. And so you can see, I'll actually read you the wording or the definition of restraint of trade. So the definition of restraint of trade is, quote, an attempt to eliminate or stifle competition, to effect a monopoly, to maintain prices artificially, or to otherwise hamper or obstruct the course of trade and commerce as it would be if it were left to the control of natural and economic forces. And so the idea is that your company is engaging in something that is creating artificial market conditions, whether that is through exclusion of any sort of competitors, whether that's through agreement with competitors to maintain your prices artificially high. So an example of restraint of trade would be something like if you've got two cable companies, right? If you've got, who are the big ones? Suddenlink, I think, is one of them. Comcast is another one. I forget who does our Spectrum. That's who it is. All right, so you got Spectrum and Comcast, let's say. So two cable companies. And if both of them say, okay, here's what we're going to do, is we're just going to divide up the country geographically. So Spectrum is going to take everybody east of the Mississippi. Comcast will take everybody west of the Mississippi. And so by those two companies engaging in that agreement, by them engaging in agreeing to just be restricted to certain territories, then they've said, okay, Spectrum said we won't cross west of the Mississippi, so we won't compete with you. So basically then Comcast would have carte blanche. They'd have the freedom to set the prices at whatever they want in their geographic region. So things like allocating territories and agreeing not to compete, that is one way to maintain prices artificially, obviously artificially high there. And so in doing that, that's something that's a restraint of trade, because if both companies were competing in the same geographic market, they would be competing for a finite set of consumers, and so because of that, they'd have to have some sort of a draw, whether it's better customer service, lower prices, whatever it is, they're trying to outcompete the other company, and so again, that's going to encourage them to get better. All right, so you can see there a violation of Section 1 requires those three things. So the first thing there is the existence of an agreement between two or more distinct entities. And so this is referred to as the 3 C's, and you'll see that on the next slide. So the two parties acted in concert or engaged in a conspiracy, or they acted in combination. So combination, concert, or conspiracy, those are the three C's. And so two parties came to an agreement to artificially restrain trade, to artificially affect the market. So the example I gave you a second ago of the cable companies, that would be two distinct entities coming to an agreement to affect the market, right? And so the second thing there is, so after you've proven that there's an agreement between two distinct entities, the second thing on there is the plaintiff has to prove that the act unreasonably restrains trade. And there's two ways the court will look at that. The first is the per se rule. And so in the case of the per se rule, that is conduct that is inherently anti-competitive. And so that includes things like price fixing, allocation of territories, or group boycotts. So the example with the cable companies that I gave you was allocation of territories. But another example would be price fixing. So let's say that both companies are in the same geographic market. They're both all over the entire country. And rather than again allocating territories, both companies then come to an agreement and say, look, our basic cable package with internet is going to cost $100 a month, whatever the number is that they put on that. And so they've agreed not to compete on pricing, and so that's price fixing then. And so the per se rule then is on its face, that is something that is anti-competitive, right? Something that restrains trade. So price fixing, allocation territories, and group boycotts, both or all three of those fall under that category. So again, things that are obviously anti-competitive. The second one on there is the rule of reason. And so under the rule of reason, what the defense is going to argue is that while the practice that they're engaging in is anti-competitive or has some anti-competitive aspects, they're going to argue that it also has some pro-competitive aspects, and so that it's going to benefit the consumer in some way. And so because of that, then they'll effectively argue that's more pro-competitive than anti. And so if it's more pro-competitive, if the defense can show that, then that would be something, a practice that would be allowed to continue. So the rule of reason is that the court is going to weigh whether the practice is more pro-competitive or anti-competitive. If it's pro-competitive, if it's more pro-competitive, then it's allowed to stay. If it's more anti-competitive, then that is something that's a violation of the Antitrust Act and is therefore not allowed. And then the last thing on there is that it affects interstate commerce because this is a federal law, so this has to be something that restrains trade across state lines. So again, because it's a federal law there. All right, so tell you a quick story here. So the individual pictured there in the lower right, his name is James Smith. His nickname was Yazoo, which is a pretty good nickname. So in 1968, the Washington Redskins used their first round pick to draft Smith. He was an All-American defensive back from the University of Oregon, and he signed with the Redskins for $50,000. He suffered a career-ending neck injury in the 14th week of his first season. Because of that career-ending neck injury, obviously it's career-ending, so he retired. And then 2 years later, he sued the NFL, arguing that had it not been for the draft, he could have negotiated a higher salary. Because again, in case you don't know anything about the draft, and it's coming up here in about 2 weeks, because I'm recording this on April 11th, but the way the draft works is that the teams are set in order, and whoever, I think the Bengals pick first this year, but whoever the Bengals pick, let's say it's Joe Burrow, then all of the other teams agree not to negotiate with Burrow. And so the only team then that he gets to negotiate with is the team that picked him. And so in the case of Smith, the only team that he could negotiate with to play in the NFL was the Washington Redskins. And so if the Redskins didn't offer him very much money, or didn't offer him a contract that he liked, he couldn't turn around and be like, oh, well, I'm going to go talk to the Green Bay Packers or the Bears or anybody else, because that's not how the draft works. And so the primary argument by Smith was that the draft was comparable to a group boycott, that all of the other teams agreed not to negotiate with players drafted by a specific team. And group boycotts are a per se restraint of trade because it's an agreement not to do business with horizontal competitors, which in this case are the other teams. So Smith won at the district court level and the appeals court level, and ultimately again, so this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in his favor and declares the draft anti-competitive. But as I mentioned, there's still going to be an NFL draft here in 2 weeks. Well, how is it that the Supreme Court of the United States declared the draft anti-competitive and a violation of the Antitrust Act in 1978, but we're still having a draft here in 2020? And the answer to that is something called a non-statutory labor exemption. And so the gist of it there is that if you have an agreement between a labor union that represents the workers, so in the case of the NFL, the labor union is the NFL Players Association, or NFLPA. If you have a labor union that bargains on behalf of the workers, the players in this case, they are able to bargain away certain things that would be in violation of the Antitrust Act. So part of the collective bargaining agreement, the agreement between the Players Association, the union, and the NFL, is that the Players Association has agreed to allow the NFL draft in exchange for other concessions, whether those are medical care or higher salaries or more structured contracts, whatever concessions they've made, they've bargained away. The Players Association, the union, realizes that that's something that's in violation of the Antitrust Act, but by allowing the NFL to do that, the players get something in return, and so because of that, that then is a legal practice. All right, so you can see there kind of the shorter version of what we talked about. So the plaintiff is going to have to prove those three things. Again, the three C's, so restraint of trade. In order to prove that, they have to prove combination, concert, or conspiracy, so two or more distinct entities acting together, that the action of those entities acting together unreasonably restrains trade, and that trade affects interstate commerce. So the defense is going to argue any of those three things. The first is the single entity defense. And so what that is that it's not, they're attacking the first thing the plaintiff has to prove. They're going to argue that it wasn't in fact two separate parties or more that have come to this agreement, but in fact that it's only one party. And so the NFL has used this sometimes successfully, sometimes not. So for example, in a case in 1994, the NFL used that defense unsuccessfully in the case of Sullivan versus the NFL. What happened there was a former owner of the Patriots had tried to sell a portion of the organization because the Patriots were losing money at that time. So he tried to sell off a portion of the organization to the public to help pay off his debts. Well, as you're probably aware if you follow NFL football at all, the only team that is publicly held is the Green Bay Packers. And so after the Packers, the NFL passed a rule that didn't allow for that. It didn't allow for public holding of teams. And so since that point, as I mentioned, the NFL has a policy against public ownership. And so Sullivan ended up selling the team at what he described as a fire sale price in order to pay off his debts instead. And so basically because of that rule that he couldn't offer shares of the team to the public, he lost a bunch of money. And so he sued the NFL because of that rule, because the public sale would have required approval of the other owners. And so he alleged that the other owners acted in concert against him and restrained his ability to get fair market value for the team when he sold it in the mid-90s. And so what the NFL said is, no, we're not, however many teams they had at that time, so mid-90s, we're not 28 different teams. We are, in fact, just one organization. We're all part of the NFL. And so because of that, we're a single entity, and so we cannot have violated the Section 1 of the Antitrust Act because with only one entity, we can't have acted in combination, concert, or conspiracy. So that's one defense. The next one there is that non-statutory labor exemption, that yes, we're doing something that's a violation of the Antitrust Act, but that has been agreed upon by a union representing the workers. Excuse me. And then the last one there is the rule of reason analysis. And so under the rule of reason, again, the court is going to examine whether or not, or whether the practice is more pro-competitive or more anti-competitive. And so one of the things the NFL would argue in the case of the draft is basically they would say, look, yes, it is anti-competitive in that it reduces player salaries because since Smith on the last slide can only bargain with one particular team, that's going to keep his salary artificially lower. But one of the reasons that we have the draft is to be competitive, to enhance competitive balance in the league. So the pro-competitive argument for the NFL draft is that, so for example, this year, I think the Bengals draft first. Basically, the bottom feeders, all the teams that are not good, draft first. And so the idea is that those teams get better talent because they get to draft earlier in the process. And so with that, they should get better players. And then eventually, those players should mature and become the leaders in the league. And so the idea is that your bad teams get good talent, and so because of that, eventually those become the good teams, and it would sort of cycle through who the successful teams are and are not because of that access to better talent, the way that the draft is structured. That's the pro-competitive argument. Of course, it doesn't really work out like that. The Patriots have been dominant for so long, and the Browns have been terrible for so long, but that's the pro-competitive idea behind the draft. And so the NFL, in their defense, would say, look, yeah, we realize it's anti-competitive, but look at all these pro-competitive benefits. It's ensuring competitive balance, ensuring that the Bengals and the Browns, etc., have a shot every year, and so that's why we do it. It's not to depress wages. We do it to make sure that every team has a chance to be successful, and so you should allow us to continue to do the draft. That's the basic line of reasoning that they would use. All right, so that's Section 1. So then on to Section 2. So Section 2, the plaintiff is going to have to prove that the defendant has a monopoly. that they possess market power or monopoly market power. So one thing to understand is that monopoly market power is different from market share. So market share just deals with what proportion of the market you own. So you have, if there's the market for phones, does Apple have 50% of the market or 80% of the market or whatever? That's their market share. So one of the things that, if somebody like Apple has 80% of the market share, one of the things that reasons that they might have that is because, arguably, their product is superior to their competitors, and so for good reason, because they have a better product, that's why they have more market share. So in that case, that's what would be referred to as a natural monopoly. Because you have the best product, of course, you have a dominant position within the market, and so that's something that is permitted. In the case of monopoly market power, that is when a company assumes complete control of the market. And so then they can freeze out competitors, they can set prices, all of those things that would, again, hurt the consumer. So first thing the plaintiff has to prove then is that the defendant has monopoly market power, they control the entire market, and second, that they used an unacceptable means to get there. So it's not just that they have the best product and none of the rest of their competitors have been able to match it, but it is in fact because the defendant has done something untoward that has allowed them to, or underhanded, that has allowed them to gain and maintain that power. So certain ways that the dominant party could do that would be through predatory or exclusionary tactics. And so as it relates to the NFL, you can see the case of the AFL versus the NFL from 1963. So the NFL was the dominant professional league in the early 1960s, and they were challenged by the upstart American Football League, or AFL, starting I think in 1958. So the AFL claimed that the NFL, which is again the established league, held monopoly status in the area of professional football, which is the product in that case, in the 17 cities in which the NFL had a team, and attempted to use its monopoly power to keep the AFL from success in those regions. So the AFL was in some different cities than the NFL was, but they were also sometimes in the same city, like New York. There was both an AFL and an NFL team there, and so the AFL argued that the NFL was using different sort of underhanded tactics to keep the AFL teams from being successful in those markets. So a couple terms on there. So predatory or exclusionary tactics. So in sports, predatory tactics could mean that an established league moves into the market of a newer team, competing for local fans, media, and marketing. So a predatory tactic, using the AFL NFL example, would be if the AFL opened a franchise in a city like Kansas City, where the NFL wasn't at the time, and then the NFL moved into that market and basically used their dominant market position. So we're the brand of football that you know. Why would you go to this lesser brand of football to try to push out the newcomers? That would be predatory tactics. Exclusionary tactics could include that an established league expanded its roster sizes when a new league forms to try to keep them from getting the best players. And so that came up in the case of the USFL, the United States Football League, versus the NFL in the late 80s. So there's a bunch of things that the NFL did there, but a thing to know about the USFL is that originally it was a spring league, so it wasn't directly in conflict with the NFL, and it was actually pretty successful as a spring league. But then the USFL decided to directly challenge the NFL, which is an interesting move because obviously by the late 1980s, the NFL had been a dominant league for a really long time. So one of the things there, you can see all the things that the USFL argued that the NFL had done that were monopolization. So they being the USFL, sued the NFL for using predatory tactics to stop their growth. So at the time, the Raiders were in Los Angeles. So the USFL started a franchise in Oakland, which is called the Invaders, and the NFL allegedly promised the city of Oakland that they would put a franchise there in exchange for helping to bankrupt the USFL franchise. Also, when they moved to the fall, the USFL had difficulty getting a TV deal, and argued that the NFL had secured deals with all three major TV networks to limit its growth. Basically, what the NFL did was it circulated the Super Bowl between the different three major networks to maintain some leverage with all three of the big networks. And so the USFL argued that the NFL took advantage of that and tried to make sure that the USFL couldn't be televised at the time. Additionally, the USFL charged that the NFL expanded their rosters to keep them from getting quality players. So the NFL did do a supplemental draft to draft USFL players. So after the people had signed with the USFL, the NFL then ran a draft and said, oh, look, you could be playing for the Cowboys or the Chiefs or whoever instead of playing for the Oakland Invaders. So with that suit, the USFL was hoping to void NFL contracts or force a merger or hopefully get a payday because they sued for $1.7 billion, and we'll talk about how that works out not well for the USFL. So in that case then, the NFL engaged in those predatory exclusionary tactics. So they didn't move into Oakland to push the USFL out of it, but again, there was probably some underhanded dealing with some of the city officials in Oakland to try to make sure that the USFL franchise couldn't be successful with the potential of getting an NFL franchise sometime in the future if those officials agreed to do that. So that would obviously be a predatory tactic. And then in terms of the supplemental draft, so they're trying to get players who have agreed to play in the USFL instead to move to the NFL, and basically kind of choking off the new league's access to players, which is exclusionary. You're trying to keep them from getting the resources that they need in order to start up this new league. All right, so same stuff here. So just like with Section 1, so the plaintiffs got to prove those two things, that there's interstate commerce and then monopolization, that whoever the dominant player is pushing out the new competitor. In terms of a defense, so there's a term on there that I haven't talked about yet, which is relevant market. And so relevant market deals with the geographic area, so in what area are people willing to buy, as well as it considers... where am I looking at? There you go. Okay, so I was looking for the actual definition, not my free-form version of the definition. The actual definition of the relevant market is the intersection of a product market and the geographic market. So in terms of product market, who is willing to buy your product, and then the geographic market obviously is where. So in the case of the AFL versus the NFL, one of the things that the court found or ruled was that the AFL, in alleging that the NFL was keeping them out of those 17 cities, the court ruled that the AFL hadn't considered 13 additional cities that would have been amenable to professional football. Basically, that the relevant market was larger. That rather than focusing on New York, maybe they should go establish a team where there wasn't one at the time, like Miami. And so because there was a larger relevant market, then the AFL had the option to not pursue franchises where the NFL already was, but instead they could go to where the NFL wasn't. And so that the AFL ends up losing that suit because of that. Whoever the defendant is would argue that they don't actually have the power to control prices or to exclude competition. So they would say, we're not a monopoly. We can't do whatever we want within the market. If we were to raise prices too high, people wouldn't buy from us, they'd buy from whoever else, right? So the NFL, if they were going to make that argument that they didn't have monopoly power, one of the things that they might argue is that, I don't know, it'd be tough for them to make that argument. But they might point to college football and say, look, if we raise prices too high, people would go watch college instead of professional football. I don't know. That might not be successful. And then the last one on there is natural monopoly. Again, that means that the defendant just has a better product. And so because their product is so superior, of course they control the market because nobody else even comes close in terms of quality, customer service, whatever it is. And so they have a monopoly, but they didn't get it through illegal means, essentially. All right, so the Clayton Act of 1914. And it does two things. The first there is treble damages. So treble means triple. And so if you are a defendant who loses a case under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and damages are awarded to the plaintiff, the defendant has to pay 3 times what the court awards. And so the idea there is to make the damages so significant that you have to pay in violation or for violation of the Antitrust Act that it's going to really dissuade companies from engaging in these anti-competitive practices. So one of the examples from sports there comes from the Raiders, obviously pictured in the lower right. And the backstory with them, or how they play into this, is that in 1978, the Los Angeles Rams moved from the LA Coliseum to Anaheim. The Coliseum then, after the Rams had left, sought new tenants, and Al Davis and the Oakland Raiders, so Al Davis is the owner of the Raiders, Al Davis of the Oakland Raiders was interested in moving his team. The move was initially prevented by the NFL via a bylaw requiring that the move of any franchise be approved unanimously by the owners of all the other franchises. And so obviously the LA Rams, because they're still in the LA area, they're still in Anaheim, they're not going to approve a move by the Raiders into LA, because now you got 2 teams in LA, and so that's competition in the pro football market for them. And so obviously the Rams ownership is not going to approve that. So officials from the LA Coliseum and Al Davis sued the NFL, arguing that the rule requiring unanimous approval was a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act as an unreasonable restraint of trade. So they sued under Section 1. The district court ruled that the NFL was not a single entity, in spite of the ruling in the Smith case. So actually in the Smith case, they ruled it was a single entity, but still the draft was anti-competitive. And so so because of that, then collusion, the 3 C's, are possible. So in 1982, the court, in this case the district court, enjoined the NFL from preventing the move and awarded the Raiders $11.5 million in damages and the Coliseum $4.8 million in damages, the sum of which was then tripled. So because of the Clayton Act, you triple those damages. And so rather than appeal that, the NFL settled for $18 million and ultimately allowed that move. So another case where this comes up actually comes from the NCAA. So in 1996, the NCAA enacted a rule that member schools must make one basketball coach, and on the men's side, must make one basketball coach a restricted earnings coach whose salary was limited to $16,000. Some schools, the big time, the blue blood schools like North Carolina, Duke, Kentucky, etc., were paying $60,000 or more for those part-time assistants. And the move was enacted as a cost-saving measure. Effectively, the membership of the NCAA said, look, we're spending too much on coaches. Could you pass a rule that said we have to, that one coach their salary has to be limited to $16,000? Yeah, we're paying $60,000, but we're losing our shirts on this. It's going to bankrupt us. So if you could pass this rule. And so the NCAA did. And the coaches challenged it, as you can imagine, because it cut their salary significantly by 75%. And so the coaches challenged it as an unfair restraint of trade and won a $54.5 million settlement, with each Division I institution forced to pay a prorated share of the damages awarded. So the idea of triple damages or treble damages is to act as a strong deterrent for violations of the Antitrust Act. In the case of the NCAA, it might have been cheaper just to pay the salaries rather than pay the damages and legal fees. And so by making an example of that organization, of those universities, then it's going to discourage people from engaging in similar practices in the future. The other thing from the Clayton Act from 1914 that's relevant is the statutory labor exemption. And so what that does is protect labor unions. And what happened there is that in the early 1900s, employers argued that labor unions violated antitrust laws because they acted in concert to restrain free trade. So what you've got there is that, so think about something like a strike. So if all of your workers get together and they go out on strike to increase their wages, employers argued that that was a restraint of trade, that was artificially increasing their wages because all those employees had worked together. They'd engaged in combination, concert, or conspiracy. They'd worked together to, in the opinion of the employer, artificially inflate their wages by all walking off the job together. And so the Clayton Act declared that labor unions are not combinations or conspiracies in a restraint of free trade and insulates them from retribution, so payback, if you will, for certain labor practices like strikes or pickets. So it allows the organization of labor which is important, and says that that's not a violation, that labor organizations are not a violation of the Antitrust Act. All right, let's stay in the same basic era and talk about the baseball exemption. So again, requires a little bit of history, because obviously we're talking about the 19 teens, we're talking about the World War I era. So in this case, we're talking about the Federal League in professional baseball. So in 1913, the Federal League was established as a challenge to professional baseball's more established major leagues, which at the time included the American League and the National League. The Federal League operated in 1914 and 1915, and at that point, more established owners bought out half of the owners of the Federal League teams to prevent the competition. Basically, the Federal League was posing too much of a challenge to the established American and National Leagues, and so they bought out, those two leagues bought out the Federal League ownership, but only half of them. So some of those former federal owners made out really well and were allowed to buy shares or parts of existing teams like the St. Louis Browns, who have since become the Baltimore Orioles, and the Chicago Cubs. And the Cubs were formed by merging the best players from the Federal League team with the existing Cubs franchise. The owner of the Federal League's Baltimore Terrapins, Ned Hanlon, and so the picture in the lower right there is the Baltimore Terrapins. It's not Hanlon, but it's a player from the Baltimore Terrapins. So Hanlon was offered $50,000 for his franchise. Adjusted for inflation, that's $1.2 million. But Hanlon rejected that offer and brought an antitrust suit against the American League and National League. At the district court level, Hanlon was awarded $80,000 and the damages trebled. So that comes out then to $240,000. If we adjust that for inflation, the damages that Hanlon was awarded amount to $5.7 million. So that's a pretty good set of damages that he won in the lawsuit. However, the American and National Leagues appealed, arguing that baseball was a sport and not a trade, and so it was, quote, a spontaneous output of human activity, not in its nature commerce, end quote. And so remember that one of the things that the plaintiff is going to have to show is that this restraint of trade, this violation of the Antitrust Act, affects interstate commerce. And so the American and National League owners are arguing that baseball is not commerce, and so therefore not subject to the Antitrust Act. The appeals court agreed, saying that baseball affects no exchange of things, because it's not like you're buying a bicycle. You're not buying a physical thing. And so the appeals court said that because there wasn't an actual exchange of I'm going to give you money for a physical thing, then that wasn't commerce. So the appeals court, interestingly, agreed with that. So then there was an appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court, in a ruling in 1922, concluded that baseball did not affect interstate commerce and that travel across state lines to perform the actual games was incidental. And a key thing to note here is that the ruling, or to point out again, is that the ruling in this case was made in 1922. The first baseball radio broadcast was 1 year earlier in 1921. All teams had radio broadcasts by 1939. But why that matters then is if you've got a radio broadcast, let's say in New York, well, there's going to be stations in New Jersey and in other states, for the Yankees, for teams outside of the immediate New York metro area that are going to carry that broadcast. And so that is very obviously interstate commerce. That is going to be something that has sponsorships from outside the state and all that stuff. And so then that makes for interstate commerce. However, prior to radio broadcasts, the primary income for baseball teams was from ticket sales, from concessions, and then from sponsors who were very much local. So if you're going to bother to sponsor a baseball team, you want to make sure that the people who see those, the outfield signs and those kinds of things, any sort of signage in the ballpark, that those are people who have the ability to buy your product, and so those are going to be very local advertisers. So because of that, the court agreed that it was not interstate commerce. And so with that then, baseball gets what's referred to as the baseball exemption. So the baseball is exempted from the Antitrust Act because it was ruled to be not interstate commerce in 1922. And so that ruling is colloquially referred to as federal baseball. So how that then relates to baseball players is this concept of the reserve clause. So the reserve clause originated in baseball in the late 1800s, and the gist of it is that a player signed a one-year contract every year. And so the team then has the option to re-sign that player the following year or not. And so effectively then, the player can only negotiate with one team. So if you get signed by the New York Yankees, play a season, the next year the Yankees have the option to offer you a contract or not. If they offer you money and you don't like it, so even if you're Babe Ruth, this is one of the reasons that Babe Ruth's salary wasn't nearly as high as it probably should have been, you can't then turn around and say, okay, well, I'm going to go bargain with the Red Sox or some other team with the Cubs. Because those teams have agreed not to bargain with you. And so the reason for that, the reason all the teams are doing that, is to keep salaries down. So that is a restraint of trade, but because the court had ruled that baseball is not interstate commerce, because baseball then had this exemption, then they were able to hang on to that reserve clause where they control the player for their entire career and they could keep salaries artificially low. So effectively, the Yankees, to stick with that example, could keep signing a player until they thought that player wasn't of use to the team anymore, and then they would stop offering that player a contract. Once the original team didn't offer that player a contract, then they could go out and bargain with other teams. Then you were effectively a free agent, but actual free agency doesn't come around until the 1970s, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. So the reserve clause then is that one team controls a player in perpetuity. We still have some iterations of the reserve clauses, and it varies depending upon the league. Now those have been bargained in the collective bargaining agreement, so those are allowed as a non-statutory labor exemption. But like in baseball, the reserve clause is I think 6 years now. It's 3 years in the NFL. Pretty sure it's 3 years in the NBA, and hockey I feel like is 2 or I feel like hockey's 3. And so there's still some iteration of the reserve clause in existence today. But again, it's part of a CBA. Baseball is allowed to keep theirs because of this federal baseball ruling that exempted them from antitrust law. So Toulson versus the Yankees is related to the reserve clause. So the story there, so Toulson was a minor league player in the Yankees system, and he was a pretty good minor league player. He wasn't able to make it to the big league club because the Yankees were such a talented team. And so Toulson felt that if he went to another organization, that he would have a chance to make the big league club. And so he was assigned to A-ball for, I think it was a season in the late 40s. But nonetheless, he was assigned to an A-ball team, and so he refused to report to his minor league assignment and tried to bargain with other teams. And then he was subsequently blacklisted. None of the other teams would bargain with him, and so he turned around and sued baseball under the antitrust law. And so the court upheld the baseball exemption and the court's basic logic for doing that, obviously by 1953, baseball is very much interstate commerce, but in the court referred to precedent and said, look, this has been decided in 1922. This is how the Supreme Court ruled then. We're not going to overturn that because baseball has been, in this case, sticking with the 1953 date, baseball has been working for more than 30 years under this idea that they were exempt from antitrust law. And so if there's going to be any change in the way that baseball operates, it's going to have to come from Congress. And so the court upheld the precedent from 1922 and basically punted to Congress and said, look, if there's going to be any change in this, it has to come through congressional action, not from the court. All right, so then let's talk about how that then relates to franchise relocation. So beginning in the 1960s, owners began to lobby local governments for funds to construct new stadiums or to improve old ones. So some teams like the Houston Astros got state-of-the-art new stadiums like the Astrodome, which is the one that's pictured there in the lower right. If you ever get the chance to go to Houston and see the Astrodome, it's still standing. That's one of Houston's perpetual things, is what they're going to do with the Astrodome. But it stands right next to where the Texans play, which is currently called NRG Stadium. And just seeing, the Astrodome was once called the eighth wonder of the world because it was the first domed stadium. And then to see that next to a modern NFL stadium, it's amazing because the NRG is just so much bigger. It just dwarfs it. It's a really interesting view. But nonetheless, owners quickly came to realize that profits could be increased by getting a publicly financed stadium with larger seating capacity and luxury seating. And so if local governments refused to back a new stadium, then the owners would threaten to move, but league rules dictated that unanimous approval of other owners was required in order for them to move. So the first left out one important thing. So from a legal standpoint, those rules violate an owner's right to increase the profitability of his team. And so, again, that is going to artificially restrain trade. His team could be worth much more. He could be bringing in much more in terms of ticket sales, advertising, etc., were it not for the other owners effectively acting in concert, combination, or conspiracy against them, right? And so the first challenge comes from the Oakland Raiders case that we talked about a little bit earlier. And so then Al Davis is successful. And so then you start to see other franchises move. So based on the result of the Raiders case, the NBA's San Diego Clippers relocated to Los Angeles in 1984, where they have been ever since. So the ability to move has been a tremendous advantage for teams who now regularly threaten to move to gain leverage over their current city to get them to finance new stadiums. So, for example, the Minnesota Vikings' new stadium cost $975 million in total, of which, I'm trying to remember if I have my stats on there, we go, of which $678 million was publicly funded. For the Falcons' new stadium, you can see there that the total cost of, I think it's Mercedes-Benz Stadium or something to that effect, the total cost is $1.2 billion, of which taxpayers paid $200 million. The Seahawks Stadium, which opened in 2002, so by NFL standards it's an older stadium now, but it cost $560 million to build, of which $390 million came from public funding. So it's been estimated that 70% of the cost of NFL stadiums around the country has been funded by taxpayers. Taking into account construction costs and ongoing costs, the following teams have turned a profit on government subsidies by taking in more money from the public than required to actually build and operate their facilities. So the teams that have turned a profit just on public funding include the Bills, the Bengals, the Browns, the Texans, the Colts, the Jaguars, the Chiefs, the Saints, the Chargers, the Rams, the Buccaneers, and the Titans. So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So almost half the league. I thought I was gonna get over the halfway point, but almost half the league has turned a profit just on those public subsidies alone. So, and you saw that recently too with with the Rams when they were going to move. They tried to get a new stadium out of St. Louis, and St. Louis wasn't doing it, and so they ultimately moved to LA, where they're getting that like $2 billion stadium that the Rams and Chargers are splitting. And you saw the same thing with the Raiders. So they're moving to Vegas this season, next season, sometime soon. Anyway, I think it's this upcoming season. But nonetheless, they were trying to leverage to get a new stadium out of Oakland or really anywhere. The Raiders have been threatening for as long as I can remember to move to San Antonio. That was always kind of their in the back pocket for them, was that they were going to pick up and move to San Antonio. So basically, teams play cities against each other to try to get as much public funding as they can, because again, then you can actually get from an ownership standpoint, they may actually make a profit on the public funding that they get. So in 2012, the A's decided that they were going to move. So if you follow baseball at all, you know that the Oakland A's stadium, which is where the Raiders played too, that stadium is not nice. That there are issues where like sewage backs up into the locker rooms where the A's players are. It's not a nice facility, right? Especially compared to some of the ones that they play in. So in 2012, the owner of the A's attempted to move the team to San Jose. So the San Francisco Giants, obviously, because San Jose is right there next to San Francisco, so the Giants obviously opposed the plan as it might hurt their bottom line, and so the Giants ownership blocked that move. The city of San Jose sued Major League Baseball, arguing that the other teams were acting in violation of Section 1 of the Antitrust Act by acting in combination to prevent the A's from making more money. The city of San Jose lost their case because of the federal baseball ruling from 1922. So they lost at the district court level. They appealed it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused to hear their case. So one of the things in baseball is that there's no salary cap. So in the other leagues, there is a salary cap. There's a luxury tax, or competitive balance tax is what it's called in baseball. But it's so small that it doesn't really prevent big market teams like the Yankees from spending as much as they want. So it really it poses a real challenge for those smaller market teams like the A's or Tampa Bay or even the Brewers, because if you can't pay your stars because you don't have enough fans, you don't have enough sponsorship money, then you're kind of doomed to mediocrity. Now, the Brewers have obviously done really well lately, and the Rays have done well here and there, but it's not as consistent of success as you tend to see with like the Yankees and the Red Sox kind of a thing, or the Cubs have been pretty good recently because they've spent a bunch of money too. So those bigger market teams are at an advantage, and so if you're an owner of a franchise, it sort of behooves you to try to move to a bigger city so that your franchise has a better chance of being successful. So why all this matters is that if you're an owner in any of the other leagues that's not baseball, you can move your team wherever you want. So, we saw the NFL teams move in between the Rams, the Chargers, and the Raiders. All three of them have moved recently. You've seen some movements quasi-recently in the NBA and also in the NHL. But in baseball, the baseball exemption lives on. All the other owners have to approve it in order for a franchise to move. And so because of that, you don't get a lot of franchise movement in baseball. I'm just going to skip over this. And I'm going to save you some time on the amateurism stuff. We'll talk about that more in a second. But let's get to Curt Flood. So Curt Flood, you can see his picture there in the lower right. So Curt Flood, the story on him is that he was an outfielder for the St. Louis Cardinals from 1958 to 1969. And during that time, he played on 3 World Series teams, won 7 Gold Gloves, and had been a 3-time All-Star. So after the 1969 season, Flood was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies and was not notified until after the deal had been finalized. So he's this outstanding player, and despite all the things that he had done for St. Louis, they turned around and traded him without even telling him that they were considering doing so, which he was pretty upset about. Even then, after he'd been traded, he was informed of the trade by what he referred to as a middle manager in the Cardinals front office, not the general manager or the owner or the team manager, so not the head coach effectively. So Flood liked playing in St. Louis and refused to go to Philadelphia. He wrote to the Major League Baseball commissioner, whose name was Bowie Kuhn, and said, quote, "After 12 years in the major leagues, I do not feel that I am a piece of property to be bought and sold irrespective of my wishes," end quote. Kuhn denied Flood's request to stay with St. Louis, and so because of that, Flood filed suit against Major League Baseball in 1970. He also sat out the 1970 season in which he would have played for the Phillies, even though it would have been his highest annual salary to that point, and he would have made $100,000. He'd made $92,500 the year before. If we adjust his salary for 1970 when he would have played in Philadelphia for inflation, he would have made $635,800. So the executive director of the Players Union, whose name was Marvin Miller, advised Flood not to do that. He warned Flood that if he went forward with this lawsuit, his life in baseball would be over. So after not playing for the Phillies, in November of 1970, the Phillies traded Flood to the Washington Senators, and so he decided that he would play for the Senators, although he only played 13 games in the 1971 season and retired shortly thereafter. So the case was decided by the Supreme Court in 1972. By a 5-3 margin, the court upheld Flood's trade as being legal on the basis of precedent of federal baseball. That effectively, baseball was in violation of the Antitrust Act, but which again artificially deflates player salaries, but also removes control of their careers from them. But because of that ruling from 1922, baseball, again, they have held that exemption. So in 1975, free agency came to baseball, which was actually through a ruling by an arbitrator appointed by Major League Baseball owners. So the story there is that there's a pitcher for the LA Dodgers whose name was Andy Messersmith, and so he was unable to come to an agreement with the Dodgers on a contract for the 1975 season, so he played the season without one. Effectively, they just continued to pay him what they'd paid him for the 1974 season. He never signed anything. He just kept playing, and they just kept paying him, and there was no actual contractual agreement. And so at that point, Messersmith argued that he should be free to sign with any club of his choosing because the reserve, so the control of the original team, only extended for 1 year, and the Dodgers hadn't agreed to a contract with him for the 1975 season. So basically that was the one additional year, that was the reserve year that they controlled him. And so since neither team had come to a contract, he in his reasoning was able then, or should have been able to sign with whoever he wanted. So that goes to arbitration. And so again, baseball hires the arbitrators. And so the arbitrator's name was Peter Seitz. And so you've got Messersmith on one side, the Dodgers on the other, and Seitz actually, even though his employer is Major League Baseball, actually agreed with the player. And so he agreed and said that teams could only control players for 1 year after their contract expired. And so that decision ushered in the era of free agency. It also ushered in multi-year contracts, collective bargaining over the length of reserves. So as I mentioned earlier, that in baseball, the reserve is 6 years, but that's part of the collective bargaining agreement. And because of free agency, that helped drive contracts up. So Flood is the best center fielder in Major League Baseball in 1970, was only making $635,000 in today's dollars. If he was operating under the system of free agency, he would have been making well over $10 million based on current player salaries. And so, as an aside, because it inflated salaries so much, Peter Seitz was fired by Major League Baseball after that decision. So, the Curt Flood Act of 1998 comes from Congress, because again, remember in all these cases, so in the Curt Flood case, in the Toulson case from 1953, every time the court upholds the 1922 federal baseball decision, they say in the ruling, we're upholding this decision because if there's going to be any change, it has to come from Congress. And so Congress finally acts in 1998 with the passage of the Curt Flood Act. So the Curt Flood Act revoked certain elements of baseball's antitrust exemption as they relate to labor practices. So current Major League Baseball players can file antitrust suits, and those are not exempt from because of that exemption from 1922. So players can file suits that concern conduct of the teams, acts, practices, or agreements that would be subject to antitrust laws if engaged in persons by any in business. Hang on, sorry. So the players can file lawsuits that would be subject to antitrust laws if engaged in by persons in any other business than sports. So an important thing to note, though, is that removal of that exemption only applies to the working conditions of players, and it doesn't apply to the other aspects of the exemptions from the Antitrust Act. So as you saw on the last slide, the antitrust exemption lives on in terms of franchise relocation, but only for baseball. However, players can challenge their working conditions in baseball under the Antitrust Act, so there's no exemption there, and so that comes from the Curt Flood Act of 1998. All right, almost there. A couple more slides. All right, so there we go. So this stuff we talked about on the earlier slide about the NFL and the USFL and the AFL. This stuff we have not, though. So I have an entertaining quote for you. So Gabe Feldman, who's a sports law professor at Tulane, has said, quote, "Sports are probably the only industry where management begs their employees to unionize. Without a union, 32 teams would be negotiating individually for 53-player contracts with no salary cap, no draft, no cost containment, and no certainty," end quote. And so the union in pro sports is really, really important because it allows ownership to violate the Antitrust Act, again, in the form of salary caps, which artificially depresses player salaries. In the case of the draft, which we already talked about, is effectively a group boycott. So the leagues do things that are violations of the Antitrust Act, but because of the agreement between the union and the league, which is the collective bargaining agreement, they're allowed to do that, and so those things are exempt from antitrust challenges. So you can see there that unions have implied exemption from antitrust laws to enter into contracts with employers, and unions have the right to advance legitimate employee goals and restrain trade no more than necessary in order to achieve those goals. So non-statutory labor exemptions are the result of 3 Supreme Court decisions related to antitrust challenges against joint actions taken by employers acting in concert with unions. So the courts have found that unions have the things that I just mentioned there, so the implied labor exemption from antitrust laws, the right to advance legitimate employee goals, and so therefore a collective bargaining agreement is exempt from antitrust challenges unless it violates certain criteria, like excluding outside competitors. So in sports, the CBA became owners' chief defense against antitrust challenges. Things that would normally be available for antitrust attacks, like salary caps, player restraints, are immune from antitrust scrutiny. So if a player were to sue the league on antitrust grounds, the league would say that they were immune because of a non-statutory labor exemption. In order to use that defense, the defense must show a restraint of trade, that the restraint of trade affects only the parties of the CBA, and that the restraint is a mandatory subject of collective bargaining, which includes things like wages, hours, terms, and conditions of employment. Another thing is that the defense is going to have to show is that the collective bargaining agreement is the subject of, quote, arm's length bargaining, end quote, meaning that each side has an equally strong position from which to bargain. And so, as far as whether or not arm's length bargaining is occurring, that's when the Mackey test comes in. And so the Mackey test is a three-pronged test that came from a 1976 case against the NFL. And the background there, John Mackey, who is the Colts player there pictured in the lower right, John Mackey and a group of then current and former NFL players challenged the Rozelle rule. At the time, Rozelle was the commissioner of the NFL. And the Rozelle rule required a team that signed a veteran free agent to compensate his former team with cash, a draft pick, or other players. And the amount of cash was left up to discretion of the league commissioner. And so the plaintiffs argued that this was a restraint of trade because the amount of cash was not agreed to by the teams, and they might be hesitant to sign players who might end up costing them quite a bit of money, certainly quite a bit more than they expected. And so while the NFL officially had free agency, the fact that if a player signs a veteran free agent, that new team is going to have to give up an unknown amount of cash and a draft pick and potentially other players, that really kept teams from signing free agents. And so while they officially had free agency, they really didn't because of this rule where the commissioner effectively had the ability to penalize the signing team. So the NFL said that the Rozelle rule was a condition of the collective bargaining agreement and therefore immune to a normal antitrust challenge. The court, in considering that, held that the players in the league were not bargaining from equally strong positions, that the players had little leverage in the collective bargaining agreement, and therefore the league couldn't use the CBA as a defense. The court also said that the rule was anti-competitive and overly restrictive, which led to the NFL changing the rule. And so you start to see the evolution toward more truer free agency, more like what we see now when a player becomes a free agent. As far as union decertification goes, in 1987, and the case is that comes to court eventually is Powell versus the NFL in 1989. But in 1987, the collective bargaining agreement between the NFLPA and the NFL expired, and the NFL wanted to maintain conditions of the previous agreement, so the one that had just expired, including salaries. The players went on strike and then sued to keep the NFL from enforcing the terms of the expired agreement. The court found that labor exemption could be invoked even after an agreement expired, and hinted that players would have to stop being represented by the union for the terms of the old agreement to no longer apply. As long as the same union was negotiating a new contract, the old rules applied until a new agreement was reached. So after this decision, the NFL players voted to decertify their union, to dissolve it. Without a union representing them, the players were not subject to a non-statutory labor exemption because those have to be bargained by the unions. And so in that case, the players were challenging the NFL's Plan B free agency, where the teams could protect 37 players and had the right. The original team had the right of first refusal to match a salary offer. And so what happens there is if you have the right of first refusal, if a new team offers your player $1 million a year and you match that, then the player has to sign with that original team. If the original team chose not to match the offer, the new team had to provide draft choices as compensation. So again, that's going to have sort of a chilling effect on free agency. And so the jury agreed that this was a restraint of free trade. And so they awarded $543,000 in damages, $1.6 million when trebled. And so the court in that case ruled that it wasn't the least restrictive means to maintain competitive balance. All right, and then sports broadcasting is going to be the last thing, and I'll tell you a little bit more about college stuff here in a second, but we'll finish essentially with the Sports Broadcasting Act from 1961. So normally, pooling the rights for more than 30 different organizations to sell to one buyer, so one TV network like ESPN or Fox Sports, etc., would be considered price fixing or monopoly behavior. This act specifically says that such actions are exempt from Section 1 of the Antitrust Act. Leagues use it to allow teams to share revenue. So basically, once the NFL strikes a TV deal, everybody gets an even cut of it. To maximize revenue, the NBA and other leagues restrict local broadcasts. So teams can televise up to, or it depends on the league, but teams can televise up to half of their regular season games on local TV. So think of something like Fox Sports Wisconsin. And they can keep 100% of the revenue from that deal. And again, it depends upon the league, whether we're talking about baseball, basketball, etc., how many local broadcasts you get control of. And so one of the things that the NBA did was to limit games on super stations like WGN. So Chicago, so the Bulls there, I remember watching them a bunch as a kid because they were always on WGN, which was, it's a Chicago station, but it was aired nationally as a super station, right? And so we'd end up, I watched them in Texas, and the same thing with the Cubs. Grew up watching a lot of Cubs games because they were always on TV because of WGN. And you see the same kind of thing with TBS, which is based out of Atlanta, that the Braves were always on TV when I was a kid. So ostensibly it's a local station, but it's really a national broadcast, right? And so the NBA was trying to limit those kinds of broadcasts, especially by teams like the Bulls. So the Bulls sued the NBA, claiming it was a restraint of trade. The NBA said it was allowed to do so under the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961, and the court said that only agreements sold by the league were exempt under the act, and that under a rule of reason analysis, that was a restraint of trade, and so the Bulls were allowed to broadcast on WGN and therefore have access to national broadcasts that some of the other teams didn't. I'll spare you all the stuff on all the college stuff is basically a history of the NCAA. A couple of the things that I would tell you that are important is that the term student athlete comes from the NCAA in the 1950s. What they were trying to do was to make sure that athletes who played for schools were not considered employees, because if they were considered employees, then the schools could be on the hook for workers' compensation. So if an athlete were injured or died as a result of injury sustained while playing for the school could be on the hook for those medical costs and those costs afterwards. And so the NCAA in the 1950s was really adamant that college players were student athletes. They were students first and therefore not employees of the school. And so because of that, they weren't allowed to recoup any sort of workers' compensation if they were injured on the job. So the fact that student athletes is a term that was crafted by the NCAA to avoid workers' compensation costs, I think is a useful thing to know. Another thing on there, as far as it pertains to antitrust law, so the NCAA has been sued under antitrust law. So I mentioned earlier the case of the restricted earnings coach where they artificially depressed salaries, and so the NCAA lost that case because they were acting in combination, concert, or conspiracy to artificially depress wages, right? And so that's a restraint of trade. They also lost an important lawsuit in the 1980s related to broadcasting. Basically, what the NCAA did beginning in the 1960s is they would pool all the TV games. Essentially, I forget the exact numbers, but basically one team like Notre Dame or Texas or Alabama or Nebraska, whoever, you could only appear on TV three times annually. Or 6 times every 2 years, I think is how they had it set up. And so the idea was to limit the amount of broadcasts, of national broadcasts for each team, and the NCAA sold those broadcasting rights to particular networks. So they controlled how many times each school got to be on TV per year. And originally the schools actually wanted that because there was this fear that if they televised their games, then people would stop coming to the games. And so they kind of wanted to limit TV broadcasting. You actually, for what it's worth, saw the same thing when there were radio broadcasts initially of games as well. Teams tried to limit the radio broadcasts because they were afraid people would stop coming to the games because they'd listen to them on the radio instead. But by the 1980s, teams, the big national teams, so particularly Georgia, Oklahoma, Alabama, etc., Notre Dame had these national audiences that were interested in seeing the team on TV more than 3 times a year. And so the NCAA was sued for their monopolistic control of TV broadcasting rights, and ultimately they lost. And so that's why you see games on all the time, is because now the teams or the universities and their conferences control the broadcasting rather than the NCAA. So the NCAA has been successfully sued under antitrust when it pertains to things like coaches' salaries or when it pertains to broadcasting rights. But if a player sues the NCAA under antitrust theory, the player, as far as I know, the player always loses. And basically the reason for that is that the courts have kind of hung on to this antiquated idea of amateurism, right? That the college player does so, they're playing for the love of the game, right? So they're playing for dear old State U rather than any sort of tangible benefit like a professional athlete is. And so because of that, anytime players try to sue under antitrust laws, they have been unsuccessful. So the NCAA is generally immune from those kinds of challenges, but as it pertains to more overtly commercial activities, whether it affects salaries of non-student employees or broadcast rights, then the NCAA is not immune from those things. All right, so all you got this week is a discussion board on the Women's Tennis Association and antitrust law. So I look forward to reading those responses, and then we'll do labor law next week, and then that's the end of it.